the story of colour is a fascinating one. I think there's so many different values that we can attribute to colour. They can be emotional, they can be physical, they can be spiritual. It's as if colour really has its own inner language. And what I'm going to do this evening is take you on a quick journey by dipping into the paint box and just exploring the significance and the symbolism of the use of red, white and blue in some of the most iconic works of art. So we're going to start with red. And I think red is the ancient colour. It's the sort of first colour of humankind. If we think of cave paintings, red figure pottery, the reds of Pompeii. It's the colour of life almost. It's the colour of blood. It's the colour of sacrifice. It's the sunset. It's everything really. And I think it's the colour that has most associations put to it. It symbolises death for some cultures and life for some others. And it has the most powerful associations. We talk about seeing red, don't we? So it's like the colour of power, it's the colour of aggression, it's the colour of control, sacrifice, obsession, seduction. The list is endless. But I think it's also a very British colour. If we think about our red London buses or our red telephone boxes or our pillar boxes, which incidentally were painted green when they were first invented, but people kept walking into them. So they were repainted in the late 1800s, that shade that we refer to forever after as pillar box red. And what I want to look at this evening within this idea of red is red hair in art. And apologies in advance to anyone in the audience with red hair, but from medieval times you were basically a witch or a prostitute. And I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about that. And I think that's why it's so interesting that in this we're seeing Botticelli picking his goddess of all love, of all beauty, Venus, as a strawberry blonde. And the fact that her hair is such a torrent of this red gold hair that's also acting very strategically in this picture is a real defining feature of her beauty. I mean, what we're seeing here is Venus being born of the sea, being blown to the shore in her seashell by the west winds and about to be closed to become part of our world. And being showered with roses, roses that were said to only bloom when she was born, and roses forever after, seen as a symbol of love. But this is about a beauty, it's about a perfection. It has so many different symbolisms and significances on a political level, on a religious level, as well as a mythological level. I really see her as the poster girl for the Renaissance that is the rebirth. She's the birth of the modern nude. And it's about an impossibility of perfection, though, because they all look as if they're floating. Try standing like that in a seashell, you'll be flat on your face within 2 seconds. When you look at the west winds, it's hard to even work out which limb belongs to which. And this really is tapping into the Neoplatonic ideals at this time, that in essence are saying if you can worship at the feet of physical beauty, you are already on your way to embrace the spiritual. So it's a divine perfection. If we then fast forward into the mid-19th century, we see red hair surfacing again, and again challenging the conventions of the time. And here there is a great mass of red hair. It almost looks like a halo around the face. And this is really a sort of signature look as part of this new canon of beauty that's being established by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This is an artistic revolution. 3 young men originally setting out to change the world and united in their rebellion against the current trends in art. And if we look at this face, it has all the features of this new canon of beauty. The elongated neck, the alabaster skin, the full lips, and then the hair. Now, it comes from a painting called Beata Beatrix by Rossetti. And if we look at the whole picture here, Rossetti himself was obsessed. His hero was the medieval poet Dante. And this is telling the story of Dante's own unrequited love, her premature death, Beatrice. But because Rossetti is so obsessed with Dante, he is forever conflating his own experience with Dante's. And it's also a painting that is a memorial to his own wife and lover and muse, Elizabeth Siddal. So we're actually seeing the moment at which she is leaving this world for another. So it has this very visionary feeling to it, and her hair looking like a halo connects in with this whole idea. I think it sort of glows with an inner spirituality. It's a bit like a piece of stained glass, actually, in the way that it looks. Now, it was a very difficult situation for Siddal herself. She's plucked from obscurity. Her rope of red hair really is her fame and fortune, and she's elevated to the pedestal, this goddess figure, to be at the top of this artistic revolution. And it was a position that came with a price, because she was treated in stark contrast in real life to how she is elevated within Rossetti's art. And in fact, her life spiraled out of control. She was addicted to laudanum, went into a deep depression, and it's said that she actually took her own life. So this is a very sad story. It's also a demonstration of Rossetti's complete obsession with this hair. If you think this is the time of Queen Victoria, everything's completely buttoned up under a bonnet. Here it's running free. And when Siddal died, he actually slid his only copy of his manuscript of poems, he was a poet as much as a painter, in among her hair, in the coffin, as this great gesture of guilt, really. This didn't stop him wanting it back, unfortunately. And her body was disinterred. It's a pretty ghastly story, actually. And he was told, oh, her hair was still glinting red in the moonlight. It was still growing and filling the coffin. And he couldn't quite conflate this with the state of the manuscript itself. But when we look at the picture, he's using red to great symbolic effect. If you look in the top left-hand corner, you can see the angel of love clothed in red, and in her hand, she's holding the last flickering flame of life. And if you look to the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a dove, no longer a dove of peace, a dove, say, of the Holy Spirit, no longer dropping an olive branch or a lily into her lap. It's a red dove. It is the red dove of death. And dropping into her open, willing hands is the poppy, which was the ingredient of the opiate with which she took her own life. And next to this, a quotation from one of Siddal's own poems. The dove was one of the nicknames that Rossetti gave Siddal. And in this poem, it's really terribly sad, as a kind of prophecy of what was to come. And Siddal really is a woman born at the wrong time in history. She was a poet, she was an artist herself. And wronged twice, really, once in life and then again in death, of how she's remembered as this victim. You would probably know her from Millet's masterpiece, Ophelia, forever seen as this perpetually drowning woman. If we then go on to think about white, white really is the colour without a colour. It can be seen as the colour of light. For many cultures, it's seen as representing purity, innocence, new beginnings, even neutrality. It taps into spirituality and into religion. If we think again of the lily of the Annunciation or the mystic lamb, or again the dove of the Holy Spirit. But it's also the colour of the seasons. It's the colour of winter. And I think that in this, probably one of the most well-known snowy landscapes, and among one of the first, we get this real sense of the colour of winter, of the silence, also possibly of winter. And this is depicting what was known as the Little Ice Age. This is the time when the whole world turned white, and birds were freezing in the trees were dying, and the old and the young were simply fading away. And it was seen as a bit of a foreboding of a bit of a message of what could be coming. And what we're seeing in this image is the contrast of the green sky sort of enhancing the white, that pure white of the snow. And we can see the great jagged peaks of the mountains, the skeletal branches of the trees, the swoop of the birds in the sky, all giving us this sense of the expanse of the space. And what we're seeing are 3 hunters that are returning from what looks like, by all accounts, a very unsuccessful hunting expedition. There is literally one squirrel hanging from the back of one of these hunters. And if you look closely, you can even see how deep the footprints are, so you get a real sense of how heavy the snowfall has been. And look at the dogs. I mean, they couldn't look more miserable if they tried. Their tails are down, they're shivering, they're not having a good time. But what's interesting is the contrast between this unsuccessful expedition and the life that's going on in the village that's nestled below, where we can see all sorts of wonderful things happening with the silhouette figures. There's people skating, playing ice hockey, falling over, putting on their skates, drinking. We're seeing life, we're seeing warmth, we're seeing people working, so that when we come back to the whole picture again, it's as if we're being told that man is sort of powerless to the seasons, and that maybe the only comfort that is on offer is from God himself. Even if you look in this area here, there's some people building a fire much too close to the inn. It looks like the whole thing is going to go up. And there's a sign hanging just by one hook, which is to St. Hubert, who's the patron saint of hunters. So the inference is clear. I mean, the Dutch are always, as we've heard already, going to remind us of what's coming, that we need to get it together on this world, because who knows what's going to be there in the next. And you could almost say that the ice is a metaphor for the impermanence of life. It's going to melt, it's going to crack, we're going to go through it. But I think that overall, it's giving us that feeling that winter is something that we love as much as we fear. And if we then think about white in a different way, white becomes a very important part of the development of abstraction, a new art for a new world. And this is happening in between both world wars. And white in itself is very important. I always feel it's a way of washing away the dirt of the trenches. And it's in the zeitgeist. If you think of the architect Corbusier with his whitewashed villas, his machines for living. And it becomes an architectural manifesto. It's almost as if white becomes a message beyond being a colour. And it's very important within the work of Mondrian, who is one of the fathers of abstraction. And it takes on this very powerful utopian spirit. It's referencing what he says, which is the point at which art will dissolve into life. So if we look at one of his geometrical compositions, what we're looking at is something that's very balanced, very ordered, but in fact there's no focal center, there's no symmetry. The 3 areas that it's divided into are not equal, but when we look at it, we get this feeling of harmony. He refers to it as a dynamic equilibrium. I think what he's saying is that there is good in the world and there's bad in the world. We can't get rid of the bad, but the good can contain the bad. So the amount of white, or a non-colour as he may refer to it, is balanced by the smaller amount of red. And when you see a composition by Mondrian, you will never see it framed right to the edge of the canvas. They're always floating within these sort of framed boxes. And this is because the lines that you see are referencing the underlying structure of the world. And they're going to keep on going. They're going beyond the canvas, beyond the gallery space, beyond and out into the world and into the universe. It's very spiritual. And really, with Mondrian, I think he's a Dutch artist. He's in Paris here, where he's achieving his highest levels of abstraction. I think that you can track his abstraction step by step through his canvases. And if you think about it, Holland, flat as a pancake, put a tree on it, you've already getting the start of your grid. His studio was a remarkable place, all painted white, many of these canvases lying against the walls, many, many layers of white paint to get the sort of surface that he wanted. It was a very powerful experience to visit his studio. He had one artificial tulip, also painted white, and he had decided that he had had enough of nature. He declared green a useless colour. If he went to anyone's house, he'd sit with his back to the window so he didn't have to interact with the landscape. And he comes to this country at the onset of war. And Winifred Nicholson, the artist that brings him, that is on the train with him, sees him smiling out of the train window. And she thinks, oh, well, he obviously just hated the Dutch landscape, hated the French landscape, but adores the English landscape. But he turns round to her with a big smile on his face and goes, just look at all those wonderful telegraph poles that are just lining the whole of the track. So to end with blue, I think blue is the colour of the sea, of the sky, of the infinite. And there are so many different blues within the history of art, and they each have their own unique story to tell. It's also a colour that's said to increase our creativity, lower our blood pressure. It's also the colour of sadness. You know, we talk about feeling blue. So it's in a way, I think, that colour has a soul. And here, this is Giotto's glorious Ultramarine, which lines the ceiling of his masterful Scrivini Chapel in Padua. And what he's doing here is as if he's bringing the whole of the sky into the chapel, but he's elevating it beyond that. It's becoming the celestial, it's the divine, it's the heavens here sprinkled with the golden stars. And this blue, this ultramarine, is phenomenally expensive at this time. It's derived from the semi-precious lapis lazuli. And consequently, it's even more expensive than gold at this point. And so the church actually control how much of this blue is to be used and in what way. And this is why invariably we see the Virgin Mary at this point clothed in blue as the Queen of Heaven, as that sort of bridge between heaven and earth. And this is a detail from the Wilton Diptych, which you may know from the National Gallery, which is a very small, portable altarpiece that was created for Richard II. And it becomes as if we're looking into a jewelled casket. It's so beautiful. But the man that is obsessed with blue beyond probably any other, and who wants to turn the whole world blue in his blue revolution, is the French artist Yves Klein. And it's this specific blue that he's after. He sees blue as a sort of symbol again of infinity, but of an idea of escape. And he is so frustrated by not being able to paint with the blue he wants, he works with a chemist in Paris and they develop his own blue, which is patented as International Klein Blue. It still has a spirituality embedded within it. He sees colour really as a way of joining the real world with the infinite. It's a sort of passageway. So he says about this blue, he's making the invisible visible. And he paints nearly 200 monochromes of this colour. Each one is numbered, and each one, Klein claims, has a different atmosphere. Sometimes they are mounted so that they're a few inches away from the wall. And the more you look, the more the colour starts to move. It envelops you. He calls it his pure idea. But he wasn't satisfied with just painting these monochromes. He's trying to break down the barriers between art and sculpture. He's trying to break the idea of the frame as being a boundary. And he starts to paint women's bodies in blue. It's a way of releasing the spirituality of the body. And women's bodies are covered in this paint and they are pressed against the canvas or the paper. They're dragged, they're rolled, they're pressed against it. He calls his models his living paintbrushes, and they are his collaborators under his direction. But it's quite an elaborate performance, as you can see here, documented by Schunk-Henders, who are wonderful art photographers of the time. Now, these were very elaborate events, but very elegant. Klein is in a jacket and bow tie. You go in evening dress. You're served blue cocktails. There's music playing that you can see going on here. Not very easy music, 20 minutes of one chord and then 20 minutes silence. And it really was pushing the boundaries as to what was a work of art. And the last time I was at the Pompidou Centre, they had a television monitor that was showing footage, live footage of these events. The monitor was on the floor, and there was a little boy, he must have been about 6 or 7, watching this on continual repeat, having a whale of a time. I don't know where his parents were, but he's watching it again and again. And I just want to put this out there, that they do say that your sexual predilections get set very, very young. But to end, I want to talk about Matisse. There's no way you can talk about colour without including Matisse, the king of colour, a man that said the moment a box of paints was put in his hand, he knew this was his life. And in the same way that Picasso liberates form, Matisse liberates colour, the great constructor of colour of the 20th century. And here, in these monumental nudes that I think are a synthesis of the whole of his career and his sculpture, you can track all of the influences with these. He's actually 2 years off his death. Now, Matisse always says he doesn't want you to know the labours his work has cost him. He wants his work to have the joy of springtime. And he compares himself to a gymnast. You know how it is if we watch the gymnasts on the Olympics, they get up on those parallel bars, they make it look so easy that for one split mad second we think, oh, maybe, forget it. He is so ill, he can't stand at an easel, he can't work at a canvas, he's confined to his bed. So he creates a new way of making art, where he actually has sheets of paper painted to the colour of his choice, and then he is cutting into them. He is drawing with scissors. He is carving with colour. It's quite a remarkable achievement. And you wouldn't think that when you see these works. They're so powerful and expressive. And I think it's interesting when we look at these, even though we understand, okay, he's cutting into the paper and there it is and it's a cutout, it's not until we actually look at the individual shapes that I think we get a real sense of what he's doing. So I've taken one of these and I've deconstructed it. So you start off with one piece like this. You add another. I mean, what a random shape. Then add another, then another, then another. And then here we have that powerful sense of the human form, with the lines in between the gaps are almost looking a bit like joints and are sort of adding to the whole sense of space. I think that these are among one of the most wonderful series of the human body. There's 4 of them. They're very rarely ever displayed together. They're so fragile, they can't travel. You may have seen them at Tate a few years ago with the cutout show. And he talks about using this blue because it's a certain blue that penetrates your soul. And I think we just read these as great works of joy. And if you're talking about colour, I think you always have to leave the last word to Matisse. And he says, colour was not given to us in order that we should imitate nature. It was given to us so that we can express our emotions. Thank you.